Chris, we're joined in the studio tonight by Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times. Hello, Tim.
Good evening.
And author of Out, which is the final one. What do you call a trilogy when it's four?
It's supposed to be a tetralogy.
But I
call it a quartet.
A quartet of books about the last decade or so in British politics. I've just got to the bit where Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are starting to properly fall out. But that means all the kind of the Brexit stuff is done. So seeing Michel Barnier come to life again in the pages, that's all happened. But then, of course, Michel Barnier is the actual news this week.
I know. It's
He's
amazing.
back.
He's back. I mean, good old Barnier. I remember when he ran for president and he started sort of saying, well, Brussels is a terrible bureaucracy and we need to control immigration. And I remember David Frost, the negotiator, saying, I had no idea he was listening so carefully to all my arguments.
Yeah.
They had all these rows during the negotiations. But when Barnier became a sort of national politician himself, it was amazing how he went for all the same tropes.
Although I always thought the thing about Barnier was he was a pragmatist in the situation that he found himself in. So the pragmatic thing to do as the EU chief negotiator was to defend all those positions and encourage all the member states to sign up to them, because that's what you had to do. And then kind of like the pragmatic thing to do when you're running to be the candidate of the centre-right party is to maybe say something different. And I think he looked quite pragmatic yesterday when he was standing down as well, sort of taking the bullet. But
yeah, no, I think
whinging.
that's right. I mean, he did keep everybody together in a way that surprised everyone. But of course, he was frozen out towards the end of both of the deals. When Frost was doing his deal, he basically did it with Stephanie Risso, and he was sneaking into the Commission building through the underground car park so Barnier couldn't see him, and she was rushing round to the British negotiating room, and they were deploying sort of young women to go out into the corridors to intercept him and say, oh, Michel, do tell us about when you ran the Winter Olympics one more time.
He loves telling that story.
And, he would basically be kind of captured and sidelined while the real negotiating was going on in the room. And in the end, von der Leyen and Juncker both kind of told him to back down. So in a sense, he was almost too effective as the guy who was holding the line, because in the end, they kind of have to go around the side of him. It was a bit like, the Ardennes, if you try to go through the middle, it's a bit of a disaster. If you drive around the side, it's kind of, it works.
As a Barnier aficionado, I, of course, was monitoring social media today and saw his son posting a picture of Barnier with his grandkids saying, start of a new adventure, I'm proud of you.
That's sort of more time with your family.
Exactly.
In
Putting a brave face on political failure.
I was half imagining you on the Eurostar, chasing him down the street again, just to, to do the whole Brexit cast thing all over again.
Been there, done that. Didn't get a T-shirt. The thing about Tim's book is I've not got to the bit where you've become political editor yet.
Well,
that's coming.
I'm sure that's several chapters.
Anyway, right, let's do our own chapter of this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the Newscast studio.
And thanks for joining us, Tim. Any more books left in you, or is that it forever now?
I'm going to try a novel next. I've had enough of reality. Unless certain events transpire in the future. No, I'm hoping I'm done, really.
Well, let's move to a different medium, though, from books to film, because, Chris, you were at Pinewood Studios today.
Yeah.
For Keir Starmer's big launch of his 6 Milestones, which is putting flesh on the 5 missions.
Yeah, and it was really... So when I set off this morning to Buckinghamshire, I'd spoken to loads of folk before going, and there was this whole thing about, to what extent is it a relaunch? And you had the Conservatives and others saying it's a relaunch. And to be fair to those in government, they have been talking about a moment like this for quite a while, going back a couple of months. But then when I got there, it felt like a pre-election event. Everything about it felt like that. So hiring a big venue where you can do all the kind of videography and choreography and all that kind of stuff, it felt like a manifesto launch. There was a document, 43-page document, I think it was, with these milestones. They had a couple of videos. They had people who were, broadly sympathetic to their cause, talking about the NHS, talking about apprenticeships, etc., etc. They had the Deputy Prime Minister doing a warm-up act. They then had the Prime Minister doing his thing, the music playing in advance, etc., etc. And so, yeah, sure, you can see a point where a government decides 5 months in that it's going to try and do a thing that allows it in the coming months, whenever a minister or a prime minister's out and about, to point to these priorities. But the way they built it up as a thing, the kind of pulling power of government, did have that, as I say, pre-election feel, 5 months after the
154 days after entering office.
Yeah, 5 months to the day since polling day.
Tim, you're always very good at working out what's going on behind the scenes that have led to these moments in front of the scenes. What do you think's actually gone on here that meant Starmer ended up at that sort of pre-election, very post-election type event?
Well, I think Chris is right. I think, yes, they have been planning it for ages. I mean, they say Morgan McSweeney and Pat McFadden sat down and...
That's Starmer's chief of staff.
Yeah.
Morgan McSweeney.
They sat down and talked about this over the summer. It was always supposed to be the thing after the budget. But if it looks like a relaunch, it sounds like a relaunch, it smells like a relaunch... you didn't have to do quite the event that they did, and there's a reason why they did, but things have not been going as well as they hoped. And, no one understood the missions, and anyone who spoke to Pat McFadden over the last 3 months, who sits on all the mission boards, would tell you that he was pulling his hair out because they were vague statements of sort of aspiration over a decade. And, the last time we looked, the next general election was in, 4.5 years' time, and they need to have something that they could point to in that time. So these are much more specific goals and tasks, and, they've got themselves in a right old muddle with the nomenclatura of all this. It's
because we had the 5 missions, so that was like the big bold goals.
So that was February 2023.
Yeah.
Then there was meant to be the structure of the manifesto.
Yeah. Then they were supplemented by the 6 first steps, which was kind of like a pledge card.
Yeah, into which immigration was basically quite hastily bolted.
Yeah. Then when we interviewed Starmer on his 100 days, he said his budget was going to have 3 priorities, which I think then became like 3 cornerstones. What were the 3 cornerstones?
What were the 3 cornerstones?
I think it's economy, borders, and national security.
Yes.
And then we've now got
I think
6...
they're now foundations.
Yes,
foundations.
They have become
I knew it was something architectural.
Yeah, so the foundations, which has security at the heart of it, is economic security, which also overlaps, by the way, with a milestone. And then you've got border security and national security.
Yeah. So let's recap then. 5 missions, 6 first steps, 3 cornerstones, and then 6 milestones, which are basically targets.
Yeah, and the targets, I've got a timeline going down to the next election, so 4.5 years max. But then there's the whole issue of what is a priority. So I asked the Prime Minister about immigration. I said, look, it's in the document, but it isn't one of the 6.
Yeah, and when I was briefed on it, for the piece I wrote over the weekend, it's definitely in.
Yes.
Well, it's in as a foundation. It's not
a milestone.
As a milestone.
Exactly. And then curiously, the behind the Prime Minister on the stage, I've just realised I've still got my little
Pinewood wristband
on. Behind the Prime Minister on the stage were the 5 missions, not the 6 milestones. So he mentioned immigration in his speech, and immigration is in the 43-page document, but as a foundation, not as a milestone. Now, broadly, I think the distinction there is that they're not putting any numbers on immigration, and there are quite a lot of numbers on the milestones, but not all of them have numbers attached. But there is that slight issue about, what is a
because as soon as you're willing
and what isn't.
Well, and also as soon as you're willing to put some quite explicit numbers that can be measured on some things but not on others, it looks like you're going a bit soft on the other that doesn't have a number on it.
Well, the Tories are having, and Reform, more importantly perhaps, are having a field day with the fact that there's no sort of fixed number on migration. Labour traditionally don't like putting numbers on it, but they can't argue on the one hand we have targets in the NHS and in schools because that drives reform, it drives the system to do something, and then say, well, we don't need them on immigration because that's just fundamental to what we're trying to do. It would be arbitrary to do that. I mean, I think they're saying they'll get the numbers down, both legal and illegal. Well, that's sort of a number, but it's not one likely to sort of see reform voters flocking to them in droves.
And even on the milestones, some of them, the numbers are limited. So on economic growth, where the big picture idea was the fastest sustained growth in the G7 group of rich countries.
The manifesto said secure that, and this document says aim for that.
Exactly. So that's a little bit of watering down. And I think 2 things connected to that. One is, certainly if you look at relative growth rates in the G7 now, the UK is miles behind. Secondly, does anyone really, and this is, I think, part of the sort of number 10 mentality on shifting to living standards, no one really values their kind of economic well-being by looking across the Atlantic and seeing how somebody there might be doing. It's about how you just feel yourself, isn't it? So there's this shift towards a sort of more human idea of of economic security. But
and I think they've taken that lesson from the US election as well, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, they saw the Democrats run a kind of growth and economy. We've got 2.5% growth. I mean, Rachel Reeves would give her a right arm for 2.5% growth.
Yeah.
But that was not impressive to the average American Midwest voter who wasn't feeling it in their own pocket. So politically, they're right to know that that's what matters to them. But without the economic growth, the actual numbers in the system, the budget's not going to add up, and they're going to have big problems in a year or two. So and they need both ultimately.
Yeah, and the projections for economic growth in the UK in this Parliament are poor, marginally better than the last Parliament, but still poor by any other standard.
Well, except Labour ministers say, though, if you read the small print of the OBR haven't been able to factor in reforms to the planning system,
indeed,
because they don't actually exist yet.
Indeed, and to be fair, reform of the planning system is one of the milestones in terms of building stuff and building homes.
And Tim, not to get too gossipy or kind of personal, but is this the sort of stuff that Sue Gray's critics say they thought she was going to be doing to prepare Labour for government? Is this an actual example of, that's something that wasn't done that should have been done?
Well, I think you can make a pretty good argument that this should have been done, more than a couple of months ago, really. I mean, why they waited for the sequencing after the budget, I don't know. But yes, I mean, they got in, and in those first couple of months, they would say that this was, the kind of thing that ought to have been gridded and worked on intensively, and ultimately it wasn't. I mean, yes, Pat McFadden and Morgan McSweeney were talking about it over the summer, but as I understand it, it didn't really ramp up until the budget was kind of out of the way. Government is not terribly good at doing two major things at once, and the budget came first, and then this stuff was put on steroids afterwards. But really, it's none of this is terribly surprising. The detail of it, and at least 2 of the 6, I think, Chris, I'm right in saying, were basically in the manifesto.
Yeah.
They've just cut and pasted them across. So, yes, this could have been done. And the fact that Sue Gray was mucking about with sort of internal wars against political aides and worrying, not hiring people who needed to be hired and not getting a team in place, and not, people said we were expecting a grid of the first 100 days, and there simply wasn't one. And this is the sort of thing you would imagine would have been part of that if they'd planned it properly.
And I'm sure if Sue Gray was here to do an interview, we'd love it if she did. She would say she was acting in good faith rather than mucking around, as you said.
I'm sure that's right.
Another name that's cropped up a few times in this conversation is Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, having taken over from Sue Gray in that role. I mean, what's he like?
Well, it was firstly, he's hugely influential. Secondly, he was, in many senses, the mastermind of not just Labour's election victory, but the whole kind of Keir Starmer project.
Yeah.
His kind of political history goes back to fighting the far right, the BNP in Dagenham in East London, borders of Essex, then being involved in Lambeth in South London with Steve Reed, the now Environment Secretary, in a battle with the hard left. So he's and then was involved with Liz Kendall's attempt at the Labour leadership, which I think resulted in 4.5% of the vote when Jeremy Corbyn first won. And then was central to the Keir Starmer project, and then shaping Labour going into the election. Pretty kind of quietly spoken, unassuming kind of guy, but is always sort of political to his fingertips in working out, well, certainly in the last year, how to ensure Labour won, and then now, as we've been reflecting on, the whole business of how Labour governs and how it continues to govern and remains politically sharp in government.
Right, let's listen to a bit of the speech that jumped out at me, because I was quite surprised by this, because this is normally the sort of thing Prime Ministers say after a couple of years when they've lost a load of battles and turf wars and the machine just hasn't worked how they wanted to do. But here was Keir Starmer saying this after just 5 months in office.
Our plan commits Whitehall to mission-led government, an approach to governing that won't just deliver change, but also change the nature of governing itself, fix the foundations and find new tools for the job. Make no mistake, this plan will land on desks across Whitehall with the heavy thud of a gauntlet being thrown down.
And he also then said too many people in Whitehall. So basically, the civil service had got used to the idea that they were sitting in a tepid bath managing national decline.
And what's so interesting is that when you speak to folk in Downing Street and around government 5 months in, 5 months in, it took Tony Blair 2 years to do the whole scars on his back thing, didn't it, in the late 90s. You hear a lot of this of a kind of frustration about stuff not being, just pulling levers and stuff happening. I know you hear this from at some point from every government in some form or another, but to have it in public as bluntly as that from the Prime Minister, privately sometimes expressed more robustly still by all sorts of folk, is quite something. And then you wonder the extent to which that helps or not, because quite a lot of ministers were saying in the first couple of months over the summer that they were trying to contrast how they were being much more sort of open-minded about the civil service and not trying to have a them and us mentality, which is how they caricatured the tail end of the last government. So how does that sort of land with the folk that then are charged with delivering this agenda?
Tim, do we know what levers they've tried to pull that have led to nothing happening? Are there specific examples? Because I feel politicians say this a lot, but then when you say, well, give me an example or name the person that refused to do the thing you wanted to be done, they never really come up with any examples. It seems to me more like a sort of feeling.
I think there's a general frustration about the place. I mean, the interesting thing here is that Starmer's appointed as Cabinet Secretary. Chris
A
Wormald,
lifelong civil servant.
the most sort of establishment time server of the four options that were available to him, and said this guy is going to drive all this radical change. I think what's interesting to me is I'm increasingly hearing from Downing Street and from other departments that people are beginning to consult their former sort of Tory rivals a little bit. McSweeney has had Conservative former number 10 aides in to talk to him about how it really works, and give him a few tips. And I remember talking to Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, and he said he talked to Michael Gove, who used to run that department, and he's gone back to the structure of the week that they used to have under Gove, because it seemed to him it would make sense, which involves a bunch of heads of department getting together once a week and trying to solve all their own, solve each other's problems. What's the worst thing you've got on your plate? What's the worst thing you've got on your plate? Bang heads together. And that was something that Gove used to do, all fallen out of habits. McSweeney, in number 10, has brought back a team called 10DS, which Dominic Cummings set up under the Johnson government, which had been largely kind of passed over and ignored under Truss and Sunak. So, you're hearing the same kind of vibes that you heard from people like that. And sensible civil servants understand that their system needs to reform. And perhaps Labour will go about it in a slightly more communitaire fashion than Dominic Cummings did. But I think the analysis of what's wrong is not a million miles away from what he was talking about.
I've been
3 or 4 years ago.
I've been multitasking tonight though, because I did Newsnight on BBC Two before doing this programme, and did a quick interview with Ellie Reeves, sister of Rachel Reeves, who's the Cabinet Office Minister. So it's Pat McFadden's deputy basically, and she's on all of these mission boards. And I tried very hard to get her to sort of repeat the line that Starmer had done about sort of implicitly blaming the civil servants, and she just wouldn't do it. Now, whether that's because she's not a particularly bold person, or whether it's actually maybe they're trying to dial it back down a notch or two tonight, I don't know.
It's interesting, the Dominic Cummings thing. So Henry Zeffman's written a piece for the...
Oh, yeah, and he talked about it on Newscast on Thursday.
Our chief political correspondent, talking about all of this stuff in the civil service and all the rest of it. And starting with the line, Dominic Cummings was right. I think that was the line he used. Which, needless to say, Dominic Cummings alighted upon on X, and it seemed to pay at least the beginnings of a compliment in Morgan McSweeney's direction for sort of, as he sees it, gripping this now, in contrast, as Dominic Cummings was suggesting, with a sort of lethargy in terms of that attitude under the Conservatives.
I'm not sure what they actually do to change this system, because it's huge. It's tens of thousands of people. It's decades of culture. Just saying it has to change.
Well, I think more to the point, I don't think they know either.
Yeah.
But I think that's what they hope these targets will achieve, which is at least to tell people.
Targets aren't a new thing.
They're not. But they can work in terms of telling people this is a priority. If you go back to the pandemic, when Matt Hancock said we're going to do X number of tests, and it all seemed very optimistic, but it did drive the system. Perhaps it took resources from other things that were important, but it did make the system kind of focus on that for a couple of weeks, and with a little bit of massaging of the numbers, they kind of got there. But, you have to sort of signal to the system what matters. And in any government, the only thing that really matters is the Prime Minister wants this. And are there enough people around him who can force that through the departments and through, does each department know where its place is in that, where its bricks are in the wall and what it needs to do? And it's a case of just trying to galvanise the system, trying to incentivise the things that you want to incentivise. I think McSweeney's criticism of previous Labour governments is that, they get into power, they think because they're not sort of natural people who've come from power that, they've got this one brief opportunity to change the world and they've got to do everything. And his big point, to all the ministers, and this is certainly the Treasury's view as well, which doesn't want to spend money on everything, is you can't do everything. You've got to focus on the stuff that A, matters to the country, and B, is likely to see you re-elected next time round. And, today seems to me, despite the confusion of all these different sort of levels of pledges, to be at least a step in the right direction of focusing, the operation of government where Starmer wants it. And, he's not been entirely clear up until now. I think he's relatively clear now.
We've mentioned Dominic Cummings a few times. The first 600 pages of your book, Tim, is dominated by him. Like, he is a once in many generations kind of like player, isn't he?
Yeah, look, you can focus too much on the backroom guys sometimes because they're the people often talking to us, and politicians are not just front of house, they also make the decisions. But for large parts of the Brexit campaign itself, and then when he was in government with Johnson, certainly for the first 6 months, it was, very intensively Cummings' plan that Johnson had kind of willingly shackled himself to, and he'd sort of almost appointed this guy to sort of whip him in the right direction. And for, up until the 2019 election, that all worked fairly effectively. It was unedifying in lots of ways, but it was the one time when, you talk to senior civil servants from then, they would say, look, I didn't much like Dominic Cummings, but I thought his sort of diagnosis of what was wrong was correct. I think a lot of what he thought ought to happen was correct. He probably wasn't the right person to drive all that himself, but that was the one period where we all knew what the government was trying to achieve, and everybody was there every morning with a common purpose, and there was no doubt at all about what the Prime Minister's top priority was. And, for precious few parts of the last sort of 8 years since the referendum have we seen politics done that sort of clearly and cleanly. Yeah, that first 6 months, I think I've written 230 pages about that. Boris Johnson only wrote 40, and he didn't mention Dominic Cummings once.
Earlier on Thursday, on the episode of Newscast we had a long chat with Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, and towards the end, he got kind of like quite philosophical about reform. Reform the party, not reform the verb. So let's listen to what he said about that.
In my constituency, which has been a sort of Labour and Conservative duopoly since, certainly end of the First World War, Conservative Party is not in second place. It's reform. This has really changed. So I'm not in any way casual about that, but I want the government priorities and milestones and ways we can be judged to make this point. We are going to make a positive difference to your life.
And he was making that point in response to my pushing him on why immigration wasn't one of the milestones, and that led him to that. And then it got me thinking, there was this Spectator award ceremony the other night there, where Nigel Farage won Newcomer of the Year. And I wasn't there, I wasn't NFI. But he then said, he sort of like...
It was a good do.
He issued a bit of, I'm sure you both
I was
had a
on
lovely...
the judging panel, so...
excellent choice of Newcomer, as somebody who tried
well, we did
to
think
be in
that was
politics.
quite amusing. So,
Great gag. But he sort of issued this kind of threat to the establishment, didn't he? Was it a threat? It was sort of reported as that.
Well, he said he was going to win the next election. So, that counts as a threat to everyone else, I suppose. So interesting listening to Johnny Reynolds there, and then hearing from others in and around, the sort of senior Labour folk and this sort of points in a reform direction, but just more broadly, really, that in this kind of era of dripping anti-politics cynicism, coupled with, where living standards have been for so many people since the financial crisis, actually delivering stuff in government and proving that you can in a way that people can feel. Granted, can measure maybe via these milestones, but it's really about feeling, isn't it, and sentiment. It firstly is hard, and secondly, if you don't do it, you're very vulnerable to getting turfed out. And if you have an insurgent party, as well as the other parties, doing and saying what Nigel Farage is doing, that already has led the Conservative Party to have its head in its hands about its future, with the sort of fracturing on the right. And then you look at what the Reform Party's predecessors were able to do in the direction of former Labour voters, in the various incarnations of the UKIP and the Brexit Party and all the rest of it. Yeah, you can see Nigel Farage's constant capacity to frighten the life out of other people.
Yeah, he's been threatening this for years.
Indeed.
That is not the first Spectator Awards I've been at where Nigel Farage has effectively said, "I'm coming for you all and you're all toast." I think both main parties are taking it more seriously now than they ever have done before. There's every evidence that Reform is more organised and is, realises it needs to get organised in a way that the Brexit Party and UKIP never did. They've got a quite serious chairman who's got a lot of money, and they're doing their best to get ground teams in place. And I've had conversations with people in Downing Street in the last 10 days where they're watching that very closely. I mean, the proof of the pudding will be the local elections. We'll see how many seats they're able to fight credibly, how many candidates they can actually get that are any good. In the past, that's proved to be a problem. But, they've been running seminars telling people how to run a constituency party. Now, it may be that a lot of Reform voters are more interested in, shouting on the internet than they are knocking on doors. And Farage has done most of his successful politicking with a kind of big air war message previously. But I think if they get anything like this kind of ground game they're talking about together, then I think the local elections could be very interesting. And, I think there's a poll in the last 24 hours that's put Reform ahead of Labour. They've certainly been occasionally ahead of the Tories. I think both parties are looking at that, the future is not certain. And the analogy that Farage used in his speech was, this will be the biggest shake-up since the Liberals disappeared in, whenever it was.
1910s.
1910s, exactly. That Labour basically replaced them as the second party. And, I think there's a lot of Tories who are pretty seriously concerned about that, to be honest.
But it's so interesting because the Reform's presence in the Commons with 5 MPs actually sounds, from chatting to you, that's a bit of a red herring.
Totally.
It's like what they're doing elsewhere that really matters.
Yeah, I mean, the local elections will be big, and what they're really targeting, I think the real test of it will be the Welsh Assembly elections in 2026, where they're talking about winning 20-25 seats there, maybe even being the largest party in the Welsh Assembly. I mean, that would be an absolute earthquake, given what's happened there in the previous.
And we've seen ripples of that this week with the resignation of Andrew R.T. Davis, the Welsh Conservative leader, and their fears of what could happen as far as Reform is concerned. And then, as Tim says, them going after those Labour strongholds.
And that takes us back full circle to the Starmer speech at Pinewood. And I thought it sounded quite Reformish because he hit a couple of those notes you can imagine Nigel Farage hitting, like, civil servants are standing in the way of change. And he referenced that now infamous...
The swamp.
And he referenced the bat tunnel, the HS2 tunnel to protect the bats. He said it was ridiculous, which actually is not the sort of thing you expect.
Well, Reform is second in 92 parliamentary seats. I think 89 of them or something are Labour seats. So while it could be that the more existential threat is to the Tory party in terms of who is the dominant party on the right of British politics, they know in number 10 that there's a lot of seats they might lose if they don't play their cards right.
Fascinating. Right. I suppose you two have probably got a Christmas party to go to.
Not
Westminster
tonight
Christmas
for me.
Oh, a night off.
Not for me tonight.
No mulled wine for you tonight.
No, not another dinner by canapé, which is very much a first world problem.
Oh, what did they used to call it in Brussels back in the Barnier days? A walking dinner.
Is that
I remember
what
when I
it
first got
is?
invited to a walking dinner. I was like, what's that? They're like, canapes or a buffet.
It's very un-French as well, isn't it?
No, exactly.
Yeah.
5 courses. What do you think your novel might be about then? If that's the next thing you
Politics
do?
and spying, I think. I've got a few things in my notebook that I couldn't include in my latest opus,
Yes, you can then fictionalise them,
which
yeah.
might inspire some of my thoughts. But,
And Chris, you've got a very long flight coming up, so Tim's book will be perfect for that.
Perfect. Exactly right. Yeah, definitely.
If you want to not take a break from
well,
Westminster.
is this supposed to put you to sleep or not? That's the big question.
Right, good to see you both.
Cheers.
And you.
And thank you very much for listening to this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.